Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of ReConnect with Plant Wisdom. It's me, Tigida Gardenia. You're going to love this episode. You're going to love this episode. When Sarah and I first got on the call and we were just kind of discussing some of the points we wanted to hit, she said, "Oh, we're going to go deep." And she was right. We went deep, and you're going to love where we ended up. And I am very excited to present to you Sarah Russo, who wrote Herbs for the Apocalypse, this graphic novel that we're going to go into in graphic detail, because there is just so much here. We talked about revolution. We talked about resistance. We talked about how we as humans don't know how to handle super powerful plants. We talked about the creative process. There was just so many aspects of this episode that are going to just put us, as we said, kind of take us into the new paradigm of what it means to have a deep connection with plants and what happens when we allow ourselves to completely kind of create this creative process with plants and what comes out on the other end. So this is episode 122, Outlawed, Plant Allies, and the Art of Sacrifice with Sarah Russo. This is all about writing Herbs for the Apocalypse and listening for revolution. Enjoy. Welcome to Reconnect with Plant Wisdom. I'm your host, Tigria Gardenia, nature-inspired mentor, certified life coach, and the founder of the Naturally Conscious community. For over a decade, I've been known as a world ambassador for plant advocacy, working closely with plants to share their practical wisdom to help you consciously embody the elements of life that nourish your evolution. In this podcast, I delve into ancient and modern knowledge from biology to spirituality about the wondrous ways of plants. Together, we'll explore how ecosystem thinking helps you overcome limiting beliefs, understand the true nature of relationships, and live an authentic, impactful life. So, Sarah, I actually found your work actually a few years back when I was first deep diving into all of this world of plants and stuff. And then I came across your novel at some point and I kind of read through it. And it was one of those things, it's actually bookmarked, which I don't put a lot of bookmarks, but it's one of those bookmarks that I have. So I'm actually really excited to have this conversation with you because I've always been curious of how did you get there? But before we jump into all of the work that you've done and the novel that you've written, can you please tell everybody who is Sarah Russo?
Thank you so much. I'm excited to have this conversation as well. Who am I, or what do I do is always a question that's really hard for me to answer. I think I'm not alone in that. A lot of people struggle to define themselves in that way. But I'm working on that question. And right now I'm in a life transition and things like that. But ultimately, I'm a plant nerd. I'm essentially self-taught. I grew up in nature, and so I've always been inspired by nature, always had a very deep connection to the planet. And when I was little, I had a river in my backyard. And so I grew up in Montana. So I had mountains and rivers, and I just grew up listening to plants. And when I was about 10, my dad at the time had started this essential oils collection. And I started reading books and smelling them. And I remember there was a moment where I had a cold. And so I looked up which essential oils would be good for a cold. And I put some in the bath and I felt better afterwards. And that was my moment of clarity. Amazing. I can heal myself. This is some powerful stuff, right? And then life leads you in different ways. And being an adolescent, I got kind of lost in other things. And then when I got to college, one of my friends, she and I both started on the herbal medicine path. I have chronic health conditions, so I started learning about ways that I could heal myself that didn't involve pharmaceuticals. And a lot of the diseases that people work with are highly complex. And so plants hold a natural complexity, which I think mirrors our internal complexity. And so long story short, fast forwarding, cannabis is what started me on the path of writing. And so I became a writer, an editor, and a communications strategist involving plant medicine. And so that's my current work. And that was always the more scientific side of things, because historically I've worked with holding a lot of complexity in the sense of subject matter and then trying to translate that to a general audience, because I'm not a scientist, but I do like to kind of navigate that world and help make that information accessible. So sometimes when there's a scientific paper, I have a lot of trouble understanding some of the deep aspects of it, but there's a lot of information you can pull out, and I work with people to help me translate that as well. Um, so yeah, and that brings me to kind of another space in which I've always been creative, and I know that's something that resonated with your project as well. There's this like side of creativity and this side of science, and they're not mutually exclusive. So that's where the idea of the graphic novel Herbs for the Apocalypse came in. I had only ever did writing articles, scientifically backed information. And then I got this idea for a fiction full novel. And that was this big learning curve for me, but I just had to follow that path. It wouldn't really let me live it down. So
I understand that feeling. And I'm glad that you talked about the creativity, and we're going to deep dive into that because I think that that's such a big piece and so important. The creativity mixed with the science. I also do plant consciousness commentary, and there I am literally trying to break down exactly that science into a way that we can not only understand it, but also with the benefit, in my perspective, like for me, of being outside of the academic world, but kind of like with a foot or like a toe kind of into it, I'm also able to read between the lines or explore what happens when you read between the lines. Because I think that that's another aspect that, unfortunately, you have such amazing knowledge and information and ideas and concepts and understandings that are coming out of these papers. But when you read them only directly, which I understand why the science world has to do that, I think you miss the richness and the extrapolation that can happen in everyday life, not just at the biological or academic type levels. And so I love doing the commentary from that perspective. And it feels in some ways like that's a little bit of what you did with Herbs for the Apocalypse. In other words, you took all of this knowledge, but then wrapped it into a completely different type of container. So
mm-hmm.
can you tell people a little before we start, because I want to dive into it already. Can you just tell people, because the book, it's a graphic novel. It's very like, it's punk, it's raw, it's like in your face in so many different ways. Very opposite from the kind of writing you were just describing. So can you explain to people what the novel is really about, and what kind of what's the angle that you decided to choose, or like that felt called to express this?
Sure. Yeah, I think you nailed it actually, the perspective of the work. So initially this idea came to me. It was the title was in place from very early on, Herbs for the Apocalypse. The protagonist is Sophia Spinoza. She's a dreamer rooted by her love of plant life, and she gets insights from plants directly, and since she was a child in her family ancestry. And so she's a Luddite, perpetually chasing an era that she never knew. She's really into records. She has a Walkman. She doesn't have a cell phone. And so uh, she's at odds with the world, and she's always been perpetually angry about the human race destroying the planet. So she goes to work in an herb shop, and the story unfolds kind of within the context of the herb shop. And so, with all the characters coming in during Armageddon, the kind of stories and things that evolve throughout time, and then the herbs start to talk more loudly. And so, a lot of plants get mentioned throughout the story, but there are 10 herbs of the apocalypse that have a monologue. So they'll come in and give insight on how to survive the end of times. And so it started off as a novel, and I wrote 3 different drafts. And then, long story short, I shelved the idea. I said, this isn't going to work. At least I can say I wrote a book. No one will ever read it. And then I got the idea again because I had never written a novel and I had never written fiction. And then all of a sudden, the idea was make it a graphic novel. I had never done that. I had to find an artist. So I did. And it took over 2 years straight of the artist Rokai and I working together. And the concept of it was, in its essence, quite unconventional. I'm not going to say I reinvented the wheel. All art is pulling from somewhere, right? But I knew early on that this concept was quite different in the sense of the status quo. And so traditional publishing I threw out the window after the 3 drafts of the novel itself. And I said, no, that's not the way I'm going to go about it. Because the spirit of the story really did want to defy rules in a lot of ways. And so in the story, 2 of the characters write for a zine. And so it kind of has that 90s zine aspect going to it in the way that it looks. And I had story developers and people I was talking through during the process of writing it. And I had people proofread it at the end, but it's very gritty intentionally. And there were certain rules of writing, like points of view and things like that, that I decided I wanted to jump back and forth between. I didn't want to just maintain this constant thread. It jumps through time. It seemed to come out quite cohesively, but it's a little bit of a wild ride. And so it's not everyone's cup of tea. But the people that it resonates with, I think it really does. And I had
Right.
more than one person tell me, oh, the character, Sophia, I know someone like her. She's an archetype, right? So it's like pinpointing an archetype of this type of person that we coexist with. And people also ask me, is she you? And I tell them, well, all the characters are me to a certain extent.
Right.
But for her, what it really was taking this part of myself that has been in the past completely devastated by the state of the world, and giving that a microphone. And so it was a very cathartic experience because I wrote the novel before the pandemic, but the actual process of the graphic novel was started in plain pandemic. So, both Rakai and I are dealing with our prospective ways of doing things. She's in Cairo, Egypt. I was in Spain, and we're just facing the pandemic together, working on this project. So it was very, it helped. It was a therapeutic experience for sure. And then the plants themselves, the 10 herbs of the apocalypse, it was an interesting consideration, because on one hand, I thought, who am I to speak for these plants? Who am I to say, this is what Rose says, and this is Dandelion's voice? But at the same time, it's an interpretation, right? Anybody can have their own interpretation. But it's interesting, when we had our talk together, you were saying Dandelion is screaming, and that was exactly how I felt about it. So there are these common parallels that we find. So it's interesting to think about plant consciousness and kind of the same types of messages that are coming through and what they might be.
Right. Well, and I think that this is where what I love about working with the more than human world, right? When you work with other kin, it's always a collaboration, whatever comes out, because ultimately we're the ones with human language. We're the ones with arms and legs to be able to do certain things that the plants can't do, right? So plants have this experience of having all this knowledge. And then there is, to a certain extent, kind of a race mind that exists, and yet every being that you work with, every different dandelion has their own pieces of personality, which is exactly what we expect, right? It's what we see in every other species. I don't understand why people think that plants should be different in this way. But ultimately, in order to get something out into the human world, it's always got to be collaboration. And what I find always fascinating is I've worked with many and I've spoken with many artists that have this process, whether they're writers or painters or other kinds of creative artists that have worked very closely, musicians, with plants. And it's always fascinating to me to see the dance that ends up happening, the period where you allow the plant to use your talents, let's just say, and your human abilities. And so you kind of almost open and you're just a channel that conduits what is coming from the plant and translates it into a human vocabulary or a human expression, but yet it's as close to the essence of the plant as possible. And on the other side is the full, you know, collaboration that happens when the plant express. It's almost like two people, you know, it is two people that are bantering back and forth, and you just are the one that ultimately puts it out into this human world, because but it comes from something that is made by both of you. Did you have that experience? Like, how did you find the creative process with the plants themselves in order to channel their voice? Like, what was that like? And did it change over the course of the, especially from the previous incarnation of like novel to graphic novel that adds really a different element to it?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Yeah. So the novel itself, actually, the graphic novel, what it turned into be, is quite different. The story formulated, and I had to make it more concise. And it always should have been a graphic novel in the end.
Right.
Now I feel like any future work I do for the creative process side of things, I want it to be in a graphic novel format, because I just feel like, for me, especially the main character, she's so provocative. And so if you
Mhm.
can actually see her, you can empathize with her better. But when she was
Right.
just words on a page, it was a little bit harder. And I had one of my beta readers say, I can't stand her. So she wasn't written to be liked necessarily, but there is a
Right.
degree of empathy that the reader can have when they're viewing it as a graphic novel. And for example, my brother, he
Right.
only reads graphic novels. He doesn't read any normal books. So there are a lot of people that I think can gain access to information in a visual sense that they couldn't if they were just trying to read a simple book. So the process of connecting with the plants for the story was very interesting, because there was a lot of information that was kind of coming through me. And I think it was you had asked me, where did it come from? I can't really say
Mhm.
exactly where. I've had friends start writing books through dreams, like this idea came from a dream. For me, it just came in. And wherever that came from, I'm grateful, because in a
Right.
sense, I feel like it became kind of a conduit for the story. And for me, it's just, okay, here you go. This is the output. This is the creation and my interpretation of that. And so on one side of things, there was a more mental, logical approach. For the 10 herbs of the apocalypse, I wanted to choose plants that would be accessible in a current state, when we're dealing with international droughts and climate change, um, that were really resistant plants. So there
Mhm.
was that. So that was like a more logical approach. But then there were the plants that just told me, yeah, like I need to
Me,
be there.
me, 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 me. It's crazy how they're like that. When I have a spirit wild plant quiz, and that leads obviously to an entire kind of experience with those plants. Oh my goodness. Like me, 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 me. I'm going to show up here. I'm going to show up there. I'm going to show up in these pots that you've left outside. You have to choose me.
Yes.
Okay. You're like,
Yes.
okay.
Yes, and I do feel there are plants that are very willing to be in the spotlight, and they're kind of what I call the divas, right? They're
Right.
demanding that attention, and then there are beautiful plants that are also happy to work quietly in the background. Um,
Exactly.
and so there are some plants in the writing process that were like my quiet aids.
Mhm.
And I wanted to start and end the story with two psychoactive plants that have been with us throughout history. And so that's the beginning is cannabis and the end is opium poppy. And so
Hmm.
that was quite clear as well, because I think about a lot of people, anybody could have their herbs of the apocalypse, right? Like this is just one I
Right.
compiled from my side of things. But I feel like those plants are really here. They've been here. Um, Opium poppy, there's evidence from Neolithic times that our past ancestors were working with the plant. So they're around, they've been here, they're gonna be here no matter what
Right.
happens to us. So yeah, there's that. And then there's the medicinal plants. All plants have a medicine as far as I'm concerned. There are some medicinal attributes that I think are more commonly known.
Right.
Um, and the intention behind the story actually was to make this information accessible and also to demonstrate that every single one of us can have and has a connection to plants. It's not something that's an esoteric, oh, look at me, I'm so special, I have this connection. It's really to inspire people to connect in the way that they feel called to. So, I mean, even if you're sipping something like chamomile tea, chamomile is such a powerful plant. It's so amazing and so accessible. So it's a great plant to connect with.
Right.
And everybody has a unique perspective, and if you talk to someone about their experience with chamomile, they may tell you something that you'd never thought about before. So
Right.
it's to kind of take herbs or plant wisdom or plant medicine off its pedestal a bit to be like, hey, this is a people's medicine. And so that's what kind of the spirit of the project is in its essence.
Oh, I really like that. I like it because I think, as I said, I have this quiz and I've been working with spirit wild plants, which are basically what people call weeds, for so many years. And I find the other thing that I really love about working with them, in addition to everything you just said, is how they pop in and out of your life in different periods of time. And like, for example, purslane is a plant that over the last maybe about 5 or 6 years, has moments when pops up, starts growing in a pot randomly. And I have this massive experience for a season and then goes away. And it's not a periodic, like this year, there is no purslane around my home, which is for the last, 2 years, purslane has been very consistent. And all of a sudden now there's no purslane anywhere. And it's like the message is so clear. This is not like what I have to offer you. The work that we do together is not necessary right now. So, go work with somebody else. And so another plant might come in and such. So I think that, as you're saying, it's like these plants are accessible and at the same time are still kind of coming into our purview, into our circle in those moments that are most important, which I think is great for the work that, for that kind of novel, for the topic that you talk about. And, going back to a little bit, just what you said about the graphic novel, we and Dom and Her have a graphic novel that we wrote also, called Checkmate in Time. It's actually a double. It's on one side is part one, and then you flip it over and you have part two. So it's really interesting the way it's written. But what I love about it is that also it's easier to do the suspension of disbelief when you have a graphic novel. It's almost easier for a person to give themselves space to experience what's happening in the graphic novel, and only after say to themselves, well, what part of that is quote unquote real, or how do I process that in a different way? So I actually enjoyed so much this format that you chose because of that. It's a different way of entering into connection with plants. And the other piece of it is, as actually a kind of like old fashioned 1980s heavy metal rocker chick, which I don't appear to be right now, but I am. And if you
Yes.
go see my social network, you'll see like where the concerts I've been to recently, and it will prove it. I
Nice.
also love the breaking from the stereotype that thinks that, people who are connected to plants have to be, the hippie sort of like, fingernails in the earth all the time, bohemian type of, like, these are the categories in which you connect to plants. And so the idea that instead here you have, Sophia, that is more, like you said, Luddite punk rocker, like that more edgy side, and how the plants still, how the plants want to work with her through that part of the personality. I also found really an important choice, and I believe a co-created choice, because I'm sure that the plants were like, hey, don't put us with another freaking hippie. We've got enough of those. Like, we chose you to write this. We chose you to write this because we want these colors and these personalities of yours to come out and start to show these pieces. So please let them shine, like, type of thing. Did you find that like the plants really wanted to accentuate certain aspects of Sophia more than others?
Yes, there's a part of her, the isolation. I felt
Mhm.
like that was an important part to kind of give space for. Because I think a lot of times when I'm feeling most connected to plant kin, it's when I'm in a space of isolation. So either I'm by
Mhm.
myself in nature or I'm meditating, right? And you can have collective plant experiences that can be also connect you to a cohesive, unified voice. But for
Right.
me, anyway, it takes a lot of kind of hermetic type spaces to be able to really tap into that because I'm very sensitive. So if there's any other energies present, I can absorb that readily. So I think that that kind of at odds with the world dynamic that is very present in the novel was important to convey, um, and to kind of give her a softness that
Mhm.
kind of expands over time as well. I thought that was important, um, because you don't want to. It would be really boring to write a character that was never questioned, or
Of
everyone
course.
says, "Oh yeah, go for it. You're amazing all the time." It was she. She definitely has the headbutting along the way,
Mhm.
and I definitely. It was interesting too, because it was written pre AI era as we know it now. And so the kind of devotion that it took and the amount of time to write a novel and then completely ditch that and then have to transform it into a script, which I'm giving to Rokaya. Because for anybody that doesn't know, when you create a graphic novel, you have to design basically, it's very synonymous with a movie script. So you have to say,
Right.
panel one, this is what the character's wearing, this is what happens, this is the dialogue. And so that takes a lot of time. And so for me, the a big part of it was this act of devotion and sacrifice. Sacrifice feels like a very big word to say, but it takes a lot of time and energy and effort. And so that was part of it. It was my offering.
I'm really glad that you used the word sacrifice because one of the things that I learned early on working with plants, and I remember this important lesson, and I remember kind of the different moments that it came in so that I could not just because it's not a like you receive it once and all of a sudden it's super clear. It's you receive it and you're kind of like, what is this? And then all of a sudden you get it in a different way and all these different ways manifest and all of a sudden the picture becomes clear over time. And sacrifice was one of those that the plants really, all the different plants I started to work with, especially in forest environments, the more I learned about ecosystems, the more I went into kind of biomimicry perspectives and bio-inspired design, the more I started to realize how important, which is funny because I went from this technical, sort of kind of like you were saying, from this technical, biological, also engineering-ish style way that all of a sudden brought me to a, I guess you could say, emotional or spiritual concept in a completely different light, which is the understanding of sacrifice in its most beautiful and positive light, which to a certain extent is something we've lost in society. You know, we have very small instances, and parasitism as a relationship approach is also a form of beautiful sacrifice that when we think of it in most terms in society, we give a negative connotation to. But in reality, there are these small pinpoints. Parenthood is a great example of a form of parasitism and a form of voluntary sacrifice that is seen still with a positive light, thankfully. And but yet we've lost all the beauty of the sacrifice in almost every other aspect of society. And plants give us such wonderful demonstrations of sacrifice in action, from sacrificing themselves to give space to a small seedling, from the way that I grow in order to get a little bit less light in order to ensure that more of the overall area gets better light, sacrificing parts of my own body, maybe a branch that falls or such, in order to make space for something else that needs to come in. Like there's so many, giving nutrients, then like sharing off nutrients because we're in a drought and therefore I need to maintain so and so who's going to come in the next season and I hope might give back to me but might not. Like there's so many different ways that plants show us this form of sacrifice that I think is something we have to reacquire, reconquer in our regular society, because true revolution, true resistance actually requires a forum of sacrifice. And even in most spiritual practices, for example, Kabbalistically speaking, the sacrifice is the Christ principle, and is also is Tiferet, is that complete beauty, because all of a sudden when I give myself into that sacrifice in its most beautiful way, everything appears beautiful, because it's like, oh my God, I can see the intention. I can see the desire from that. It doesn't matter that the application of it might not work or that it might not be perfect. I see what it was meant to be, and therefore I see the beauty in the intricacy of however it is that it's developed. So I'm glad that you spoke about sacrifice, because I do think that it's just a lost archetype, and it would be so important for us to reconquer it and to understand that sacrifice can be extremely beautiful and something extremely enriching from the beauty that it projects in you. So, kind of like, which is, I'm imagining, and I hope that that's how you see this whole process of all those years that it took you to get this novel out.
Yeah, that's a really amazing point. I think I agree. I think that we lack the connection to sacrifice in the modern Western world, in the global North, anyway. And I think that there are many traditions like sacrifice. Initiation also is one that I
Mm,
feel like we really lack.
yep.
And there are a few examples that I can think of. Something like getting a tattoo can be an initiation
Hmm.
experience. But the construct in that we see them is a lot of times, if I think about sacrifice in the current world, it's sort of a selfish sacrifice, right? It's like, oh, look
Correct.
at me. I just did this thing and I now have a presentation for the board or something like that, right?
Right,
And
right.
I didn't sleep all night and now the presentation's done. But this kind of, I think plants give us the opportunity to just surrender to the unknown. Like, this is the
Hmm.
work I need to do.
Right.
And I do it. And I don't know what the point is necessarily or what the outcome might be, but it's just going to be done. And it doesn't have to
Yeah.
have a definitive end necessarily as well. It just needs to be done. That's all I knew with this project. And I was really frustrated when it was a novel, and then I went through so many drafts, and even kind of what killed the novel itself was getting a professional edit. And I work as an editor now, so it gave me a lot of perspective on what not to do. But I remember there was one point where they said, this is very unrealistic. I'm like, oh, all right, well then it's just not going to work out because
Exactly.
um and so yeah, to kind of defy the constructs, I think a lot of times that the kind of renaissance of sacrifice needs to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. In Kabbalistic terms, we say that Tiferet is about do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Period.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter.
Yep.
And that's the sacrifice. You don't know what's going to come out of it. You just know it's the right thing you have to do. And it's not based on, because the kind of two counterpoints that are closest, one of them is you do the right thing because you're kind of feel beholden to the not the outcome necessarily, but like these are the rules and these are the rules I need to follow. And in the other side, I do the right thing for others, right? Like I do it because they want me to do it or because I'm trying to please. And once you get to that beautiful, beautiful sacrifice is I just do the right thing because deep inside of me, I feel it's the right thing to do. Period. It doesn't matter. It could benefit somebody. It could not benefit somebody. That's not the point of it. It could be because there's a rule that tells me I'm supposed to do it or not. That's not the point of it. I just do it because I know it's the right thing to do. And I feel like when we get there, it is, like you said, it's such a liberatory, like you feel that liberation. You feel that sense of detachment from the outcome, and you realize that that's what it's going to be. And I've just found that I have never been able to understand, in all the years I had studied and researched and tried to understand and was on my path and all these things, it was the plants that made this concept sort of grounded this concept inside of me. Just sitting in a forest, you realize that that has to be the guiding principle that makes all of this work. Like any ecosystem you sit in, that you're like, okay, there are beings here that are constantly sacrificing themselves in so many different ways. And look how beautiful it all looks at the end. Look how it comes out. Like, oh my goodness. So it's amazing, which I do think is a revolutionary act. And I think it is a point of, that is something that changes it profound. When you get into that place, it profoundly changes our ability to influence, if for lack of a better term, I'm trying to think of the right words, the future, right? It is the ultimate act of revolution that I do something just because it's the right thing to do. Like that is the ultimate revolutionary act, that I know that this is way it's supposed to go, and I am going to do this from a deep down place. Did you find that your concepts of, for example, working with these 10 plants, especially with a theme around the apocalypse, right? Like the whole concept of where we're going. How did you find that your definitions, or did they at all change around resistance, for example, resilience, around revolution? Like what came about, and where were the plants? How were the plants influencing this kind of journey that you were on?
Amazing question. Yes, I feel like it did change and evolve, because the whole thing was a weaving process, right? Because
Mhm.
I'm very stubborn, and people have criticisms of being stubborn, and it can be good and bad. But I think with the stubbornness comes determination, right? So I was
Right.
determined. Once I started this graphic novel approach, determined. But then I was sitting there with the plants. And so, for example, every one of the 10 herbs of the apocalypse, I spent as much time possible with them. So, rose
Mm.
is one of them. I had a rose growing in my yard at the time, and I sat with her and meditated. And I'm not really, to be totally honest, I'm not that kind of person that does actively think about that. Like this was an exercise, because I know some of my friends who have gone to herbalist school, they have an approach where they do that. They'll take it in this form and take it in that form, sit with the plant, have it around them. And so I was really trying to adopt that. So that was an interesting shift for me. But the big message with Rose, and for me, I thought initially, okay, Rose has to be there. I wasn't really quite sure why, just because obviously it's iconic, it's been with us throughout time. But then once I was sitting with her, it was this insight into all of the medicinal properties that this plant holds that most people don't really think about, right? Because we just think
Right.
about growing her for beauty, aesthetic, smell, right? So it was that. It was like, there's a lot more to me than meets the eye. And don't project upon me. It's not for your projection. So, kind of, there was a lot that I learned actually through sitting with the plants. And some of them I developed a deeper relationship with in the end after having this experience with them, and writing and rewriting them. And, cannabis was one of the plants that I had the longest running connection with. So, but, at the same time, she's such a force to be reckoned with that I felt very humbled by the experience of trying to write her monologue. Like, what is she actually, of all the things she's going to say, what is she going to say here? And so even that, I had been with her for a long time. She's an instrumental part of my life. It was the cosmic connection, the connection to everything being one. And, we're all just floating particles of stardust in an ever expanding universe. And
Right.
that oneness and the kind of like trying to define me into a drug, it's not really working out for you. It's like the breaking of constructs. So I wanted to have her set the stage with that. And then later comes in nettle. And it's interesting that you do a lot of work with weeds, because I think four, if not more, of the herbs of the apocalypse are weeds. And so I liked
Mm.
her kind of energy, which was a dominatrix. It's like Mother Nature owns you, not the other way around, you know?
Right.
Um, and I had I made mistakes with nettles before. Like there's the process of urtication where you actually hit yourself with stinging nettle to lower
Mhm.
inflammation, right? And I thought, great. And I was being foolish one day, and I said, oh, my stomach's feeling a little bloated. Let's see if this works. And I hit myself
Oh,
with, yeah, and I couldn't sleep that night because I had such bad rashes. And so that's
I'm
also,
just picturing you there going, I'm just going to try.
yeah. And I think that that's important to note in this as well, is that anytime you think you got it figured out, you will be
Mm-mm.
schooled. You know, it's
Yeah.
just, you don't know anything. And so that reminder as well, the humility piece of, okay, I thought I knew what was going on, and now it just takes this turn.
Right.
And then there were really funny insights I would get randomly. Like one time I was having a session with cannabis, and I got this image of, in the graphic novel, there's the cannabis goddess who appears at the beginning, and she pops back in later on, and there's a concert that's not supposed to be happening, and the cops show up at the concert, and the cop says, who's got the dope? And then the cannabis goddess flips them off with her leaf hand. And it came to me like that, like that's so silly, but it just was this idea that came, you know? And so kind of working with that and figuring out, okay, this is a silly idea, I'm going to integrate that into it. Or sometimes you get silly ideas and or really interesting concepts that you have to edit out. So in the concepts of writing, there's kill your darlings. So there were some real darlings that I had to kill, but it's just part of it, because in the end you connect with what needs to be said. There's a certain depth as well. So there's a depth of things, and other people might not pick up on that, and that's okay, because they're actually going to be picking up on some things you didn't even realize as well.
Right. Right. And I'm happy that you're talking about cannabis in this way because, for example, I had Sydney Kale on the show, and also her book, which is called The Love Language of Plants, that she co-wrote with a number of different plants. And we read it as the Plant Wisdom Book Club. And in the book club, when we read it, we realized that she had called the chapter that she co-wrote with cannabis, she called it hemp. And I think it's hemp is what she called it. And when she was actually, I had her on the podcast, but she also came to the final discussion around her book. And we all were like asking her, like, hemp is not the plants, here you are writing about Damiama and all these other rose and all these other beautiful plants that you've had these experiences with. And all of a sudden you called it hemp. And she said that it was because of kind of more pressure from the outside to give a name that's much more generic. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not even the plant. That's the product that the plant produces, the fabrics and things that get, or other aspects of it. She's like, I know. And she's like, if I am in the next edition, that's going to be one of the things I'm going to change and fight for. And I think that it's beautiful that because I think cannabis is today in society going through this kind of like swing where, because of changes in laws, because of changes in things like that, there is, more people that are connecting to cannabis in a way. And yet, of course, we have a lot of superficial use, right? We have a lot of that aspect. But what I have found in talking to people is that those that give themselves that opportunity to experience, allow themselves to enter into a connection with cannabis at a whole different level, and how important it is for that process to just unfold in whatever way it's going to be. Like, I think we try to judge, and this happens with all kinds of plants, whether we're talking about, ayahuasca or some other kind of plant. And of course, there is always, even with dandelion or with nettle, there is the opportunity for abuse and misuse, and of like, you're just missing the point of working with these plants. That's always going to happen. That's on the human, right? It's the human to understand whether or not they're trying to. I always say to people, the most important thing of whatever, especially because I work with multi-potentialites and I work with people who have like lots of different passions, who jump around from thing to thing to thing. And I'm like, it's always about the intention. If your intention is running away, whether it's working with a plant and your intention is to run away from something, or whether you're, have following your dreams, but you're really running away from other stuff, that running away is never going to work. And the plants show us that constantly. They're sessile, kin are in place. They can't run away. And they're trying to tell us the way to resilience and revolution is not running away. It is dealing with shit. And so if you want to work with me, you've got to deal with it. You've got to go through it. You've got to sit there and experience it and feel it. And you can't run away from it, Even the nettle said that to you most clearly. Like, you want to just fuck around and find out, I'm going to show you, but you can't run away from it once you do that. Now you've learned something. Where do you want to go from here? Like, where do you want to go from here? And that's really how nettle is, right? Let me give it to you straight. Let me I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm going to put it into your face. And then after, I'm going to give you the chance. Where do we want to go from this? So you can experience everything else, all the soothing that comes, but it's because I've given it to you, and now you're going to sit in it and we're going to work through it.
Right. Yeah. It's such a gift to be able to receive insights from plants and the different kind of personalities they offer, right? Because there are certain plants that are sort of that tough love. Some are just so humble and open and giving, and others are kind of, I'm not sure about you.
Yeah, exactly. That's so true. And I'm actually curious about this only because you mentioned it. Why? And I have my own theories, but before I go there, in my attempt to be somebody who holds and like gives more space, and like to not have my words sort of clutter everything, I'm so curious as to how you ended up with poppy, and as opium poppy in particular.
Yeah. Opium poppy was one that came to me right away when I created a list, and there were some edits and revisions. Cannabis was on there right away. Poppy was on there right away. So poppy, the way that plant has shaped humanity and continues to alter the future of humanity is incredible. And I think it's definitely a tool of resistance, because if you think about the stigma that this plant has, I mean, and then the dichotomy and the hypocrisy, right? Because what Poppy talks about in the monologue is, my seeds are widely available in the supermarket, yet wars are waged over me. Like, how can society view a plant in the same way? And it's actually because of the twist of the hand that humans tried to make this plant better, that it became what it is now with the opium epidemic. For example, there was opium. That's the resin taken from the head of the flower. And then they've discovered morphine was an extract, right? And so morphine revolutionized modern medicine. So even still to this day, if they're doing any studies on a pain-killing drug, they measure its efficacy against morphine. Is it more effective or less effective? And so then they notice, oh, this is an amazing medicine, but it has the potential for addiction. What do we do about that? Let's make heroin. And that was created by a pharmaceutical company called Bayer, and we all are familiar with Bayer. And then it became illegal. So then, since then, I don't even need to get into the details, but it's very complicated. But now we have the opioid epidemic. in North America, but now it's spreading to different parts of the world. And
Right.
it's because we don't know how to handle plants with power, with great
Right.
power.
That's a great way.
And instead of understanding them, trying to understand, trying to find a way to work with them, it's stigma, criminalizing the plant and the people. Because Afghanistan, one of their ancestral plants is poppy, and all the wars that have been waged and continue to be waged because of the war on drugs. And for me, I wanted to have a plant that represents this senseless act of destruction. And it's an attack on nature. Not only is it an attack on people, it's an attack on nature. And so that being said, in the end, and what the plant says is like, I'll still be here once you're gone. So, I believe having there's labdamum was the tincture extraction in the 1800s, 1900s that was made from opium poppy that was available as a pharmaceutical product back before they criminalized poppy and cannabis in the United States and in other parts of the world. So to have a poppy tincture, an opium poppy tincture on hand in the event of the collapse of humanity is going to be essential. I mean, it's one of the strongest painkillers around. So that's why I thought this is it. I don't want to say the herb of the apocalypse, but definitely holding down this concept and holding this power of death as well. Because I think that in the apocalypse, we obviously have to reckon with our relationship to death. And we're doing a really bad job of it. And Poppy shows us that.
As you were talking, you brought, so what I love this about these conversations, and I love being able to go into this level of depth, is that recently I've been having lots of conversations with different people. We were just talking about it in the recent iSprouts monthly gathering, which is a gathering that it's kind of our gathering that we do every month in the naturally conscious community. And in there, we were having a conversation about ancient civilizations, even those that are kind of, to a certain extent, unknown to humanity today, even from, Atlantean and Mu and all these others. But one of the people in Andini was talking about the fact that there's, I guess, a writer who talks about an ancient civilization that comes from an alien race, blah, 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 regardless of what you mean, what you believe. But the point that was coming up that we were really discussing deeply was that over and over again, humanity is given the opportunity to deal with its own personal level of complexity and development, its emotional intelligence, our ability to deal and wield great power effectively, and also in a way that is, I don't know, for lack of a better term, because I don't think we've coined the right term yet, because we don't know how to do it yet, altruistically to a certain extent, or maybe in a way that's sacrificial, like in a way of selflessly. There's all these types of words, but I still don't think we have the right one. And as you were talking, I was realizing that, yeah, we always say that we blame outwardly the things that we ourselves haven't been able to deal with as human beings. But this one about, like you mentioned, poppy as well as cannabis and others. Holy bejesus, what a great example of us humans, like blaming an external force and punishing plants for basically something that we as humans can't control. Permit me, I'm a pretty extreme when I come say certain things, and people, whatever, take it or leave it. It is the equivalent of the burqa that you put on the woman because the man is too weak to control himself in the vision of beauty of what is a full woman. And so let's put a burqa on a woman and cover this woman because I, as man, can't control myself. And so therefore she needs to be hidden because, if I see her skin, I'm going to go crazy and I'm going to do things. And it's her fault because she is exposing too much of her beauty. And in some ways, criminalizing cannabis and poppy and coca and all these other plants is the exact same thing. It's saying, you're so powerful, like you said, right? We don't know how to handle plants with great power. So you're so powerful that I'm going to throw a blanket over you. I'm going to put a burqa over you. I'm going to put a chain over you. And I'm going to say that you can't be let out, even though the weakness is not the plant. It's me as a human being who can't control myself.
Yeah, I think that there's this, unfortunately, innate desire in humanity to understand. I say unfortunately because it's great, because it brings us about innovation and
Right.
advancements, right? But with that, it's this need to simplify and distill down to bite-sized pieces that we can comprehend, right? So I
Right.
think that a lot of plants in their essence are beyond our ability to grasp in a lot of ways. Like, I am all for plant science and figuring out the ways, the mechanics of how plants work, and let's innovate and make some remedies that really help humanity. All for it. But at the same time, there's always going to be aspects of plants that science won't be able to elucidate, like the energetics
Exactly.
of plants. Impossible. There's no way. I mean, however advanced science gets, I don't think that there's any way for them to really be able to wrap their head around that. And so I think it's
Right.
important to note that in different cultures, the approaches are vastly different. So, in the global north, it's this idea of plants being these single solitary things, and we need to figure it out, and da 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 da. Well, each plant in of itself is a whole world, right? And so,
Right.
to be able to wrap your hand around that is going to take devotion, time, and energy. And that's really not something that the global north is equipped to deal with. Like, time and energy,
Exactly.
I don't want to have to do all the work, right? But then you have cultures that have carried ancestral wisdom for millennia and continue to do that. So you brought up coca. Coca is a plant that's interwoven into cultures in South America, and it's a great fallacy of the global north to say, oh, like, we want to get rid of that, because that's it's essentially degrading their ability to practice their culture. And this concept in the global north as well of, like, take a plant, we take it for medicine, we take it and take without having any sort of sense of, like, what that means, what our
Right.
relationship is to these plants. So I think that that's the biggest issue, is that the cultures that are the most disconnected from plants are the ones that are governing international law. And
Right.
so they don't have the tools to be able to make informed decisions. So right now I'm working with a university in Colombia, and we're doing a integral coca leaf monograph that will look at this plant in a scientific light, but also in an indigenous light. And we have methodologies that support indigenous ways of sharing information in the stories. And one of the points of this is to help educate policymakers, because right now there's a big push internationally to deschedule coca, because right now there are 3 plants that are internationally scheduled. One, we all talked about them: cannabis, opium poppy, and coca. So that's got to change, because
Mm-hmm.
all these plants are insanely powerful. They're tools and allies and kin. They should not be criminalized. And I think until humanity can stop criminalizing plants, we have work to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's I'm so glad that you brought this up, because this is not a conversation I hold often. And yet it is kind of the underlying perspective, because this is the criminalization, like the outward persecution of these plants. And then it trickles down into the way we deal with weeds, the way we look at, and we create these pesticides, all these other pieces, I think, are just trickle downs from from what you just said. And we have to deal with the fact that we are outwardly punishing what we internally don't want to deal with ourselves. And it
Mhm.
goes back to that whole fact of, what are the plants trying to teach us? be sessile, be present, deal with your shit in the place that you're in, not just geographically, but even emotionally where you are, and stop trying to blame everything outwardly and stuff, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work, folks. It doesn't work. If you don't deal with it, it's still going to continue. Like, just because you think you can eradicate it physically doesn't mean that everything else is going to change within you. You're just going to then move that desire over someplace else. And so eventually, what are you going to do? End up sitting in a room like by yourself, closed off from everybody else because you haven't dealt with your stuff. And so it's like these plants, as you said, they're super powerful because what they do is throw things in your face. I say that one of the reasons I love living in community is because you can't hide from yourself. Your shit is right there in your face all the time. And this is, I think, what people experience when they go off into the woods, right? They're not alone. We keep talking about like, oh, a person goes off into the woods. They're not alone. Everything is in their face around them. Like all these plants are just constantly throwing everything into their view and making them deal with it. And that's the reason why people who spend long times in the woods or whatever end up coming back with a sense of peace and of calm and of enlightenment, because those plants are helping them work through it. They are kind of just sitting there and putting everything in front of you and making you deal with everything that you have to experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A
At least
mirror.
that's how I see it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
They're just reflecting.
Exactly. So Sarah, I think as usual, we would just keep going and going and going. There's so much here. First of all, how do people get the book? Herbs for the Apocalypse. Sarah Russo, where do you find your book? Where do you find this graphic novel? We want it.
Thanks. So I decided to make this graphic novel only available in print. So it's self-published. It's only available in print. I want to initially say thank you to all the crowdfunders. They helped us create it. And so with that, it can be the version that it needed to be, which is exactly how it is in all of its gritty imperfection. And so we printed 300 copies, and they're only at the time of this 20 left. So you can
get it now. Get it now. Get it now.
Yeah. So you can go to herbsfortheapocalypse.com.
Which I will put into the show notes.
Yes. And that's how you can get it. You can, and if you have any questions, you want to reach out, you want to connect. If you write the website, you'll get me. Quite some months ago, we were not really doing social media or anything like that. So yeah, the best way to get in touch is definitely through the website.
Okay, perfect. We will make sure that we include the links and put it all there. Sarah, this has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. And to everybody who's listening, remember, these are the types of conversations we continue to have inside of the Naturally Conscious community. And also, we have things like the Sprouts Writing and Creativity creativity group, not book. Although maybe now that was just an omen that we should write a book about this, because co-writing and co-creating with plants really does change the way that you experience that type of practice. It becomes something more, an expression that is beyond the human world. So come into the Naturally Conscious community. Let's continue these types of conversations, and let's experience this co-created world and the resilience and even revolution that comes from a deep connection with other kin. Thank you again, Sarah, for being here with us. And to everybody, thank you for listening. Remember to like and comment and hit the subscribe button, all those important things to get this message out to the greater world. And remember, always resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of ReConnect with Plant Wisdom. To continue these conversations, join us in the Naturally Conscious community, your premier online ecosystem for plant reawakening and accelerated evolution and co-creation with other kin. Here, you'll find expansive discussions, interactive courses, live events, and supportive group programs like the Plant Wisdom Book Club and the Sprouts Writing and Creativity Group. Connect with like-minded individuals collaborating with plants to integrate these insights into life. Intro and outro music by Steve Shuley and Poinsettia from The Singing Life of Plants. That's it for me, Tigria Gardenia, and my plant collaborators. Until next time, remember, resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. I'm out. Bye.